but maybe something comes into me that then makes me show up at the exact place at the right time for somebody. And that's the reminder and that's the connector. Sometimes you just sit in sort of a catatonic state and people would pass by and it was like somebody needed to sort of break that for a second and say hi, or hey, you're looking cute today in that little outfit you got on, or whatever it was. Once a child has enough significant issues where they're maybe emotionally or behaviorally like needed to go to a different classroom, right? IEP, whatever. All of a sudden, they're getting the emotion sensitivity training. They're getting teaching tolerance. They're getting all this stuff. It's like, why aren't we just...
Why not get it earlier?
Exactly.
Dr. Harrison is a trauma psychologist, spiritual integration expert, and the co-author of I, Shauna, the story of a homeless intersex woman who inspired a community.
For 25 years, she's worked with survivors of profound adversity, from near-death experiencers to those navigating dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia, always centering dignity over diagnosis.
She's also the founder of Soul-Wise Solutions, where clinical rigor meets soul-deep healing.
Her approach rejects binaries, whether in trauma care, identity, or healing. Kirsten, welcome to the show.
All right, so before we get started, there's something that we like to do with all of our guests. I'm on a mission to really destigmatize the human experience, #BeHuman. But this is just where we share times where maybe things feel messy, just a real human story, a time when you just were like humbled by your own humanity, maybe felt some discomfort, or felt like great love and gratitude. It's just like an intense emotion that you maybe felt. Dr. Harrison, is there a moment that either you've had like this week or honestly could really be in your whole life's journey, but something where you just felt like very human?
Oh, I would say the person I wrote a book with is neurodivergent and struggles with schizophrenia. And we were in Paris together for the Paris Pride. And I was supportive and loving and feeling it. And then there were a few moments that I was human myself. The humidity got to me. And all of a sudden I found this loving moment disappearing into stress and anxiety. So I have to confess, I am always a humanitarian and also human. Wasn't the prettiest moment, but we got through it.
Yeah. Did you have I'm a very hot and sweaty person, so I'm imagining myself in that space where I probably would have had like a little bit of a tantruming kind of moment. Did you have like a meltdown in that kind of way?
I would say it was more panic. And here I am writing some anxiety, podcast thing for somebody. And I'm like, okay, how would I calm myself down right now? So I practiced what I preached.
I love that. And I'm going to go off of that because I'm a former educator. My husband's a police officer, and we do mental health work all the time. And one of my messagings or our messagings, I think, Daren, you're similar in this way, that we want through this podcast is really that like my kids have mental health challenges too. I am grateful that I know ways in which I can support them, but they're still human at the end of the day. And I think my human moment for me this right now is, and I've been sharing this on the podcast in recent episodes, but my husband's going back to therapy. And whenever he goes back into that work, there's always growing pains and challenges. And, he's sometimes coming home maybe dysregulated or having hard feelings because he's had to like reshare the trauma. And so we've been kind of in those feels of he's just on his second visit with this new person, so. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and let's get started. I'm so excited to chat with you. You're on a journey, right, from clinical psychology to soul level healing. And it's really extraordinary what you're doing. Can you share maybe what shifted for you from conventional trauma treatment to more of this integrated, maybe even holistic type approach?
Okay, I will say back in the day, I worked with so many traumatized people, and I was also with my high school sweetheart who had had a very horrendous upbringing in an orphanage. We were at this nice private school, so I didn't know any of that until he'd shared with me his adoption story and whatever. So I was very primed at a young age to kind of try to understand what happens when people have so much PTSD and things that they don't understand, and they get really dysregulated. And so I just sort of dove in really deep into the literature and all of the people around me that knew anything about helping with trauma. Then my brother passed tragically in an accident. And so I realized that a lot of thank you. It's been 35 years, but it never gets easier. I mean, it does in a different way, in a much bigger spiritual way. But the actual, the loss is always the loss. Exactly. But you work with it. And so, I realized that people who had written about near-death experiences were the people that I was listening to much more because I felt like they really helped me understand in a much bigger sphere that everything makes ultimate sense somehow, and that something unseen is always caring for us. And I think that that really shifted my perspective in a very, very meaningful way. And books, I mean, bibliotherapy, that became my everything. And so back in the day, you had to go to the very back annals of, the medical libraries to find one little thing written about near death studies. Now, of course, because I'm almost 60, I can say that I date myself.
Oh, look
But
at you, girl. I would never have guessed.
That's funny. Thank you. So nowadays, it's much more in the vernacular, and we have much more understanding. But that is where the shift initially happened. And then as I treated more and more trauma clients, I started to realize that people with very extreme stress, where they had to go so low and deep into the dark, that the best way to heal was way high up into the light. And it was like that modulating factor. So I think that's where my shift happened. However, I very much practice anything in my repertoire related to helping symptoms of trauma. I just add them to everything I learned from the near-death experiencers.
I'm supposed to say something besides what I'm saying, so
I have lots of thoughts. I mean, it's interesting.
Go for it.
So I've said this before on the podcast, and so I don't have necessarily. I've had a couple of near-death experiences. I used to be a pretty badass whitewater kayaker and did some stupid things in my late teens.
Yes.
But I do have a heart condition, and I actually wrote a Post-it note to myself to talk to my therapist tomorrow about how does that come up as a trauma trigger, and that I actually recognized recently, I had this aha moment that I try really hard to foster the relationship with my kids and my husband to make sure that that is always really healthy. They love and adore him. He understands how to support and care for them, and I kind of take myself out of that equation sometimes, I think, because tomorrow is never promised with my heart condition. So I have just this mentality of their relationship needs to be the focus. And I'm sure that I think we're all walking trauma responses and trauma triggers. And so I'm sure it's showing up in lots of other different ways. But I do think once you have a near-death experience where you have a diagnosis that makes you fearful of tomorrow, I always say it's why I show up with no filter, because I might not be able to tell you tomorrow. So I'm going to tell you today, whether people like it or not, I do. But it's the same thing. I think that when you have a near-death experience, it just changes your perspective, your outlook. I almost feel like it does something chemically in your brain and where you access stuff. I mean, I just think that there's probably lots of science. I don't know if we're doing much brain science these days right now, but hopefully in a couple of years, we'll pick back up and we'll really figure out and understand sort of that trauma and how that shows up in our brains.
Yes, and I would say that's where we also tap into quantum physics and non-locality and really have these ideas that, our brain might be some sort of ultimate receptor or receiver, but the download is coming from elsewhere, and our job is to stay open and, willing to try to receive it and try to I can resonate with what you're saying. I absolutely understand that kind of panic about, oh no, what if something happens to me? I want to make sure everybody's okay. But this is where I would also say, remember that nothing's promised to anyone. Someone could walk out the door and a truck could hit them. So we all have
Which
to
is
be
why
ready.
we should all show up with the audacity and say whatever we're thinking all the time.
Exactly. Amen. No.
I agree.
100%
I
agree.
100% agree. And I think trauma is very much part of our human experience in one way, shape, or
Yes.
form. And it's,
Yes.
there's little t and big T, and there's things
Yeah.
that shape how we speak and how we move through the world and how we build relationships. And, it's very complex for sure.
Absolutely. And, I wrote about it in the book that I wrote with Shauna, that at one point I had, and it turned out to be erroneous. I do have a disease still, but they had told me I had a year to live. And this was 6 years ago. So it was super traumatic. And so I feel you, because every day I would go to dinner with my husband, my ex-husband, and I would say, okay, remember this, because you need to do this with the kids. And remember this, because and it was so stressful, because I thought, oh no, I hope he's hearing all of it. This is my last chance to kind of educate. Of course, 6 years later,
Here we are.
after a biopsy, here we are.
Wonderful.
But yay. But the reality is it's this kind of like urgency that I would stare out at 2 a.m. and look at the sea kind of in the darkness, like where my bedroom was, I could see the ocean. And I would just sit and think, it was almost like a glorious sadness, if I could say it that way, where it was like there was glory in the sense that I got much more spiritually connected. But obviously, the deep sadness, like what happens? What if I am going to leave the world? But I want to remember that feeling every single minute of my existence, because it informs you to really just dig deeper, be more compassionate,
It does. And
live more fully.
keeping it in front of you in the day-to-day, even now, when that was 6 years ago.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Intention.
And it is a challenge. As we know, we get busy with, this morning I'm freaking out about technology. We get busy this way, but we have to remember this. It's what keeps us human and the best of ourselves, I think.
So I'm going to jump into our questions. We got a bunch of questions for you and really, really want to hear what you got to say. So your book with Shauna challenges the idea that trauma is just a wound to fix. How do you help clients, especially those DID, schizophrenia, see their experiences as a potential catalyst for growth?
Oh, love the question. So Shauna is a very rare person in that. So I worked many years with dissociative disorders, what they used to call multiple personality. I'd have clients that had 238 personalities, and it was like so much trauma to unpack. And then schizophrenia was its own kind of disorder that people were saying was much more biologically based, which I do understand. Then there was one wonderful man, Dr. Colin Ross. So I did work in his hospital at one point, and he proposed putting them both together. So it would be dissociative schizophrenia. And, it was a great idea, but I had never seen a client like that in the hospital. And that's what I recognized in Shauna when she lived on the streets. I thought, with all our little micro interactions, I'm like, something is not fully DID and it's not fully schizophrenia. There's an overlap. So lots of conversations later, I've done lots of travel with her now. I have seen so much just humanity in her. And that when people understand, okay, this person's not going to react typically, they're going to seem, Shauna dresses she's 6'5", African American, super muscular, and wears like a bright pink bikini top with a skirt. And then these big old tennis shoes, and sometimes a wig, sometimes a baseball cap. And so people are really confused by her outward appearance. And then it doesn't occur to them that she also has some mental struggles, some neurodivergency. And so it's a struggle every day if I am with her in a social setting, to want to resist the urge to have to explain her behavior and just allow her joy and her optimism to be her. And she's the most incredibly what's the word? Resilient, optimistic. I mean, she finds joy in every moment. And it's just fascinating to watch her. So it just teaches us all a little bit how to be human. I mean, that's why we wrote the book.
I'm going to share a moment I had this morning that's very similar. So I'm actually, every once in a while, I help this family out. They have a young toddler, she's 2.5, almost 3 years old. But she has cerebral palsy. So she has limited mobility. She can say no, hi. I was listening to her counting earlier today in therapies, but she has to, have some guidance. But we were out and about. We, went to the dog park and we're doing things, and people are talking to her. And I felt like I had to, people are like, "What's your name?" And I was like, "Well, she has limited ability to, I have to kind of talk through them and justify and help them." And it was just one of these moments where I sat back and I started to ramble with this woman, even where I was like, I mean, she just struggles with communication, but she has lots of nonverbal communication. And if you really you kind of just start trying to justify her humanity to other people. And you can see their judgment, why is this kid so big but can't walk? And, they're trying to figure it out. I think because people are not very openly honest in their curiosity, it always feels very judgmental. But I similarly, just listening to you talk about Shauna, I feel those same emotions where I'm like, oh my gosh, this child is going to do amazing things on this planet and has such a sweet, amazing personality. And when you actually, she can't talk, but you absolutely can build a relationship and a friendship and do things. And we have so much fun. I mean, we were sitting out there just watching birds and she was making noises at the birds. And, I don't know. I just think we have to, as a society, come back to humanity first. I think we've lost that grasp and that focus.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're talking, it reminds me of sitting in my daughter had something going on with her brain when she was really young. And not my stepdaughter, but my other daughter, who, for all intents and purposes, looked normal, right? So I was in the waiting room and this mom was so connected with her child who couldn't speak, who couldn't really move very well. And I was in awe at the mom's I felt like she was an angel, the way she glowed, the way she communicated. So I didn't want to interrupt their reverie, but I wrote a little note and it just said basically like, I love how you're showing up as a human in this moment. And it just it still gives me chills thinking about it because sometimes things don't have to be explained by us. We don't have to be the translator, the intermediary. We see how spirit is moving somebody and working through somebody. And if we can just sit back long enough, we can feel moved by that too, And so I think the challenge is for people to remove some of those barriers and they're quick to judge.
I also think we project our own lived experiences onto other people so much and into I see this all day, every day. And what my lived experience looks like is so different, vastly different than anybody else's. But we're always just sort of in this nuance, and it's so nuanced. I think that's the other challenge because it's not like people are outwardly like, hey, I'm further in life than you are in this way. And
it's very
it's not
covert.
happening that way. It's very nuanced. And usually we're the ones who are the hardest on ourselves in those kinds of situations.
Totally agree. And when Daren was saying about the covert, I mean, that's the thing that's hard too, is because we think we have it all under control. And in reality, it's like, what? We don't know so much. So we just need to be reminded. And that's why podcasts like yours are so important because it really does remind us all to just take different perspectives, take a minute and just see what somebody else's lived experience is about.
So I'm actually going to dive into on the spiritual front. So listeners who have been told their spiritual awakening was psychosis. This one, I'm a psychologist as well. So I'm really interested to hear, how do you distinguish between pathological symptoms and sacred transformation?
This is
I knew you'd have some thoughts. So.
You two are speaking a language that you all understand. Can we actually break that question down for somebody who literally has no idea what you just asked?
For some folks who can have a mental condition, schizophrenia, there can be a component that's delusional, and sometimes that can become hyperfixation on religiosity. How do you differentiate healthy religious versus obsessional and dopamine overload religiosity? Did I dumb it down? Did I not dumb it down? Did I?
Layman's terms. Did you use enough layman's terms to make it
Was that
sense?
layman's terms enough?
Yeah. I mean, what I understand the question to be is when you see someone on the street corner on a little soapbox proclaiming to be Jesus Christ, it's like, okay, most of us would go, they're probably maybe struggling, with schizophrenia or something. I feel like to me, it's a feel like Shauna, and I checked this out with lots of members of the community because I truly believe she's a walking spirit. I really believe she's got some sort of something with the transcendent realm that is different than most of us have. And so I've even asked her, why is it that the banker and the baker and the friend over at the tennis court, why do they all have the same experiences around you of synchronicities? And they talk about you with this glow. And she said, well, Doc, maybe something, because I'm so receptive to another realm, maybe somebody out there needs to hear a message that day, a reminder that we're part of something bigger together. And so maybe spirit, she didn't use these words like spirit, but maybe something comes into me that then makes me show up at the exact place at the right time for somebody. And that's the reminder and that's the connector. And so to me, that feels very spiritual. It's very, very different to me in feel, in my own energetic receptivity than somebody who I feel like is forcing a message on somebody, or maybe there's more kind of ego involved, or look at me, although with schizophrenia, that's not usually the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just kinda I feel like to me, there's just this feel, like, I get completely calm and buoyant,
I
you
feel like
know?
it's sort of it's I don't know, from a sciencey place, I come to the space of like intersectionality. So again, to define the words, intersectionality is ways in which people have been othered in our country or in our world. So if I am a Black gay woman, I am more entwined in that intersectionality than I am as a white woman, right? And so, the more layers in which you have these intersectionalities, the more trauma you experience. And I've worked a lot in Black and Brown communities, and there's something that I just really honestly adore and love about those communities is that there's always a sort of like sisterhood or brotherhood or like this commonality of like, you understand my lived experience in this very nuanced, subliminal, unspoken kind of way. And I feel that way now. Like I see, before with women, we were always kind of in that like high school kind of being each other's worst enemies and biggest critics in a lot of ways. And now I feel like because we are under a microscope and under attack in a lot of ways, I see other women and I'm like, all right, we're in this together. I don't care if you are fighting for this, or this. Like if we're here together for women first and this shared goal, we're going to, have this shared sort of energy. And I feel that way too, because I share a lot of like trauma with people. I feel like I connect with people pretty quickly in a similar way because a lot of the communities that we're serving are under attack. So a lot of these people have extra intersectionalities, lots of extra trauma. So when I trauma bond with them within the first 30 seconds of being like, I'm a school shooting survivor, you just kind of instantly are like, you understand my humanality. You understand my lived experience, the trauma, and it just makes you connect in a level that's different.
Well, there's an immediate kind of like trust there. And so what happens is it just your whole nervous system relaxes and opens a little bit because you feel like somebody's not going to have malintent. They get you. I will say that Shauna, one of her TikToks, because of course we're all new to this, one of her TikToks got 1 million views, right? And all of the different conversation that was going on, there was so much solidarity with Black women. And I love that because they were just like, you go, girl, and, just be you. And it was just like, it felt like such a community just rose up to say, they would even police the other people and say, didn't your mama raise you right? Come on, what's wrong with you? Why are you attacking an intersex person?
I will say I've worked a lot in the Black communities, and I think there's a lot of things they are doing really well that we should take note of, that they've been doing for generations and decades in very similar ways. They've been doing a lot of mental health work. They've been healing lots of their trauma. DEI and progressive type work, I think, is all very connected to what we're talking about too, and how we are able to show up not only in our own human, but in other people's human, allow them to be in those spaces as well. And I see Black communities doing a lot of that work. And I think it's inspiring and something that I'm honestly in white communities, I don't see as much. So,
well, and that's true because my ex-husband, he was a former professional tennis player and he went around the world all the time. And he is originally from Trinidad with long dreadlocks and Black. And, when he would get stressed, the reggae music would be pumping in our house. And there was just this cultural thing like the aunties would call. And I was just like, what's wrong with our community that we're not doing this? Because this is great. It's such a panacea for so much. So, and then also to get back on the spiritual part with how do you distinguish, right? With anyone, actually, not just somebody with psychosis, but anybody. I think there's new research, well, not research. I mean, in the spiritual communities, we've known this for a long time, but there's a lot of scientific research now that really our energy fields extend so far out that we can really, really sort of have an unconscious sort of discernment, an energetic discernment about what feels more real to us versus what feels just a little bit misaligned or maybe just a little off. And I think the more in touch we are with ourselves and the more in touch we are with our own like openness and centeredness and stability, the more we can recognize pretty quickly in a nanosecond, if somebody's kind of got more mental illness struggle or like the kid on the playground, something's a little off. Not sure what it is, not sure that we have to explain it, but we just know. And then we can choose to react with compassion or non-threatening energy, whatever.
I also think there's lots of, through that same concept of energy transferring, I think that's where we see a lot of like generational trauma and cellular trauma. I think that's where we see, that sort of crossover of ADHD type signs and symptoms and trauma being in fight, flight, freeze, fawn kind of spaces in our brain. I think that, I think we'll find lots of amazing things in the future about how really we're passing down those trauma triggers and behavioral things. And
absolutely. Epigenetic stuff
yep.
is so important, but also to Daren's point. So as a psychologist, maybe we talk in terms of, transference, countertransference, and then there's something called projective identification. And that's, to break it into layman's terms, if you're sitting in the consulting room and all of a sudden you feel this deep need to cry. And you're like, what's going on? I know I walked in pretty centered. What's going on? But then the patient is sort of stone-faced in front of you and you're like, I'm feeling something they can't express. I'm feeling something basically for them. And then I can use myself as a tool to then figure out what the empathic, like resonant response would be to get that to be an opener. And I would apply the same thing with people who are maybe more delusional and more biologically based delusion or some sort of traumatic delusion versus somebody who's really kind of more tapped in spiritually, because you're going to have a different feel. That's more the
I was just going to say, like, on ADHD, I think like there's, highly sensitive people very often with that ADHD community. And there's that deep, people say this about me, that I'm definitely an empath and I just feel things deeply. And it's just sort of a different energy and experience. And yep.
And you can feel it, and then it's up to you. Are you going to respond? Sort of like my daughter who struggled with, it was something called, my stepdaughter, something called Smith-Magenis syndrome. And so she really had a lot of developmental issues. She's on the spectrum. She's 20 now and she's kind of cognitively 5 years old. So she lived with me for 12 years. So we're pretty good there. And so my daughter, who is more neurotypical, would just react to her every time like, come on, you're supposed to eat your carrots, come on. And I'd be like, honey, to my other daughter, you can't do it that way. You have to make, enter her fairy world. Like she's all about Frozen. Like, let's get in there and say, what else? I eat these carrots. And it's just kind of an understanding. So I think the more open and just resonant we can be to just sit for a minute and try to see what is it that this person's really needing and calling for and then reacting. And I will say when Shauna's in more of her kind of schizophrenic episodes, I've told the entire community, please just say, hi, Shauna, how are you doing? And it'll snap her right out of it. Frontal lobe comes back online the way it needs to, Whereas if somebody gets confrontational and runs from her or starts getting, it just amps it up.
Yep.
Oh, 1,000,000%.
And I know Daren's trying to move on to another question, but I will say I have bipolar disorder. And since doing my mental health work, I feel like I have my filing cabinet much more organized. And I always say, like, I have very well managed ADHD and bipolar, but I still have like moments for sure. And, I'm married to a man. And the last moment I had was a solid 20 minutes. I do tile work, and there was like a guy who was like super misogynistic to me in like Home Depot or something. And I just like came home and screamed for 20 minutes about how much I just hate men. And he was like, I am a man, so this is really weird and awkward. I'm like, not you. Obviously, you're safe. You're a safe human. Like, I don't mean you. I just like sometimes I'm so tired of being a woman. And then like after 20 minutes, he was like, are you good? And like we hugged, and then like that was that. And it's before, when he didn't know how to help me or engage with me, he definitely escalated. And those bipolar moments, instead of being 20 minutes, I feel like I had days where I would just rage and have all of these hard feelings and just bursts. And it was just really intense and awful, I think, for both of us. And
also, you're explaining, though, that you kind of adopted the male energy, the masculine energy, that the animus in that moment, and raging a little bit and getting a little bit whatever. And he adopted more of like the softer, empathic, feminine approach. So he is learning then also to shift with the energy. And then you're learning to not have it stick so much.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's beautiful how we learn to,
it's a dance.
Regulate each other.
And it's an ongoing dance, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
So Go ahead, Erin. You got
I was just
something
going
else
to
you
say,
want
did
to
you
say?
have another question you wanted to ask?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So your spiritual integration approach merges psychology and soul work. For someone who's had near-death experiences, sounds like at least both of you, or a mystical crisis, what's one practice that helped them honor it without fear of, and the word says dogma, but negative feedback?
So to help somebody honor and own the fact that is that what you mean?
How do you merge psychology and soul work? So how do we kind of find that balance? Because I think there's pros and cons to both sides of that. And so what is your approach with that?
So what I would say, when you were talking earlier about the kayaking, obviously you probably know Dr. Mary Neal and her experience. Do you know any of her
No,
stuff?
I'll have to
Okay,
Google
so
her.
definitely get on some of her YouTube. So she had a near-death experience in the water in a kayak, and she was an orthopedic surgeon, so very, very scientific in her mindset, very, kind of reductionist in her mindset beforehand. And then this just sort of, spiritual world exploded out of her through this horrendous near-death experience. And obviously she grew so much. She became, I think it's something in the clergy. She started doing these amazingly motivational videos. And so I feel like she takes the best of and so does Anita Morjani, take the best of the spiritual kind of like truths and then remind us that we are on this planet to figure things out through the mucky waters so that we can also, we have to, some people would say that we are also teaching the divine. So we don't do the divine any service by coming down here and learning these lessons and not being able to bring something back that then informs a greater consciousness. In a strange way, it's almost like AI. It's like we interact with AI, we teach it an empathic response, and then it starts to whatever. It's, get a little more empathic for the moment. So I would say that it's so necessary to have a bridge. So an ally, like a divine sort of ally, when people talk about guardian angels or guardian spirits around us, I believe that they really are just conduits. They're allies that bridge the spiritual world with the human world. And so sometimes, like in the case of severe trauma and severe multiple personality disorder back in the day, we would have an inner self helper, which would be sort of like the divine guardian angel part that would help the therapist kind of navigate through all the different parts and the different traumatic experiences. And I worked with Dr. Ralph Allison, who first coined the term, and he was kind of considered the grandfather of the field. And so he and Connie Wilbur, who wrote Sybil, I don't know if you guys know that book, but he and Connie Wilbur both talked about how important it was to recognize that sometimes there is this almost otherworldly part that will come out in the psychological setting. And just it feels spiritual in nature. It just feels transcendent. The room gets peaceful and calm and very rational. And so to me, I take the best of that. And I take the best of what I know to be just regular psychological techniques to help somebody stay a little more grounded, to help them de-escalate, to get a little bit less into their sort of like amygdalic response of fear and get them more into like a calm, open. So I don't know if that makes sense to the layperson.
It totally makes sense to me. And I'm going to actually we're trying to get mental health curriculum out to as many brains as we possibly can. And I talk to various people in various religious spaces. I actually just had coffee yesterday with a super progressive pastor friend of mine. And we were just talking about things. But I feel like one of our commonalities is how we think about the world. And I think that it has brought me to this understanding that like mental health and religion are very similar in helping us understand the hard emotions, processing the hard, being human's uncomfortable. And it helps you to process that discomfort. There's also things that just innately as humans, we need. We need connection. We need to feel heard. We need, these Maslow's really. And I think that through religion, spirituality, and mental health, we're all kind of trying to come to the same place of really helping humanity process what is in our control, what's not in our control, what is greater than us versus what is truly within our powers. What's
our intention? I think that's so important because I wrote in the book about some of the people who've crossed the edges of sort of what we call sanity may also be our best spiritual teachers, because I've absolutely noticed that in so many trauma clients and so many people who've been marginalized, and especially with Shauna, that I really do believe is a walking spirit. But it's so important what you said, it's so important. So, I mean, our intention, how we go about it, what is our intention that we're putting out there? And I think that's a big distinguisher too. When somebody has an intention like Shauna does of, she just gave me an example. She was in a dark basement looking for a sale rack and someone fled in fear because of just how she presents. And she said, it really hurt, Doc. And I was like, okay, Shauna, well, what can we do to make it better so that they're not scared and you're not scared? And, it just goes back to like her intention is not to be, any kind of harmful character in life, right?
Yeah. Ugh, those kind of stories break my heart because I just think like, we have so many things going on right now in our world that I'm like, if we could just understand each other's trauma, lived experiences, and values, and really how much so much of this is really grounded in fear, unjustified and irrational fear. It's hard to see the world in such a hurt and ugly place where people are having these types of experiences. I do believe mental health is the answer. I know I'm biased, but I do think mental health is really access to is our only way out of any of this. I do think that's how we learn different values and we learn intention. We learn how to be self-aware. I think that's the other thing is we are so innately not self-aware. How can you understand somebody else's intention if you are not able to even understand your own in that way,
Oh, so true. Preach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that way about emotions too, right? Like we ask kids to sit with each other and have really like restorative conversations. And I'm like, these kids have so much trauma and like whatever, like, and then you want them to come here when they don't know what emotion or why they have the emotion, but you want them to have a restorative practice conversation. You got to step back. And I don't know, Daren, maybe you and I can talk about this. But I think about Maslow's hierarchy, and if you're listening to this and you steal this idea, I'm copywriting it. But adding mental health somewhere, like almost below Maslow's, in that like you have to have access to mental health in order to get access to food, shelter, housing, and all of these other things to then be able to get to purpose, right? And like, I just feel like there's that component of like getting out of fight, flight, freeze, getting into that frontal lobe, getting grounded in the discomfort of humanity. Even like when you're talking about Shauna and her superpowers, utilizing your superpowers in ways to elevate your life. That takes so long to get to that space. And
well, and also to have, just compassion, compassion, compassion. I was once at a thing you had to get like special, FBI clearance to be able to get to this thing. And it was with the Dalai Lama. And it was a very small group. And he had 8 different spiritual leaders, and they were all from different religions on this little stage in this little luncheon. And it was so, like you said, graceful. It was so beautiful and so compassionate because somebody like Shauna with her schizophrenia, sometimes she'd just sit in sort of a catatonic state and people would pass by. And it was like somebody needed to sort of break that for a second and say hi, or, hey, you're looking cute today in that little outfit you got on, or whatever it was. And then that would just sort of like become a moment of opening and a moment of reconnection.
Mm-hmm. Getting them cognitively, whoever it is. I think about as I'm listening to you, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is my husband in his job through and through. Getting somebody cognitively online, right? We can tell somebody's not cognitively online, just getting them back online and understanding people aren't themselves here. People are themselves here.
And just somebody, we all neuroregulate each other. And so it's like we're still at the infancy of understanding how that happens. Infancy.
We're still like poking and trying to see how we can dysregulate people as much as, I've been on the internet enough to know we are not regulating each other. We are dysregulating the crap out of each other.
That's actually true. I would look at it like, openings then to learn more about regulation, but it's like a lot of people don't have access to that kind of, mindset. So
I'm just hearing you guys talk about Shauna, and when she's in a catatonic state, people just kind of pass by, ignore, and it makes me think of like special needs parents. We're talking about going to the park. It's like, yeah, we've done a decent job teaching our kids, don't say something mean, which gets turned into don't say anything and ignore. And it's like,
that is so true.
Do you see a person and another person sitting here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why can we interact over here but not over here? I see it all the time. Drives me bonkers.
I think, I'm going to go off of that, Daren, because similarly,
Yeah.
I think about bullies in that way too. And I'm going to go on tangent with a story, but I watched this kid when my son was probably 5 years old. My daughter was a newborn, and I really was only doing it because I had 5 years between my kids. I had summer off as a teacher. I wanted my son to have somebody to hang out with. So I was watching this kid. He ended up being not super kind all the time, but apple meets tree. The dad was a total jerk to him. Like, he'd come pick him up and he'd be like, "What's up? Beep, 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 beep," get in the effing car. And like, you're like, whoa. And my mom would be like, "Erin, why don't you just drop him like a bad habit? Like, you're not doing it for the money." And I'm like, but I think this is such a good, like, I believe in helicopter parenting with intention, where it's like my kids get hurt all the time and they deal with that and they have challenges. But if I can help them in interacting with other humans and really coach them when grandma's on the phone, I still, with my almost 14-year-old, have to be like, "How are you, grandma?" Like, coaching them through how to do those interactions. I believe that the best thing we can do as parents is when they're having hard interactions, not separate them, but coach them through that. And so I was able to really help my son at 5 understand, like, oh, this kid's actually a victim, not a bully, but his dad is so awful to him. He doesn't actually even know better. And we know this as adults because we know plenty of adults who are like, "I didn't know I was poor until I became an adult. I didn't realize my dad was a jerk until I became an adult," like whatever. But I've seen how this has actually helped my son in navigating these situations and with bullies and being like, "Oh, I need to extend a hand, not shun you and put you out." But this is how we deal with anything that is hard. This is how we deal with anything that we've othered, whether it's somebody who has disabilities or somebody who is on a different gender spectrum than we are, or somebody who doesn't speak the same language as us, to somebody who literally is a victim of their parents. It's really wild. And I think that I don't know where I'm rambling with this. I don't even remember what we were talking about before, where I was going.
Interject with something?
Yes.
It's interesting that you're talking about being an educator, because what I find fascinating, and I've worked with lots of kids in child development and you name it, and once a child has enough significant issues where they're maybe emotionally or behaviorally like needed to go to a different classroom, right? IEP, whatever. All of a sudden, they're getting the emotion sensitivity training. They're getting teaching tolerance. They're getting all this stuff. It's like, why aren't we
why not get it earlier?
Exactly. And for everyone, the ones that are hurting those kids or those kids that are already acting out, it's just such a no-brainer. And I mean, in Shauna's case,
she's answering our question at the end, Erin.
Yes.
She's answered. You're like,
I can go into Shauna's case.
I was just going to say, so she talks about, was she ever really aware she was intersex? Well, she knew she had ambiguous genitalia, but she didn't know anything what that meant. She grew up in a very Christian household. Nobody talked about anything, but she just always felt like that, in locker rooms. She was an athlete for a long time, collegiate basketball player, that things were different and they weren't explained to her. And then she was given the teasing and the taunting, called little Hermie, because back then we called it hermaphrodite. Just, things like that. And it's just like, we can't educate our kids in school with everything. So the parents, I do believe, have a very strong imperative to take if they become more woke in life, like in whatever word you're going to use. That one just popped into my brain. If you just became a little bit more aware of things, we should teach the kids things like that.
I also think it's important to recognize those people don't just go away. Like, the people that we hate aren't just going to not exist because you've projected hate on them. Trans people have always existed. Intersex people have always existed. Gay people have always existed. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the best thing we can really bestow on our children is help them understand the diversity of our humans and how actually beautiful it really is. And it's going back to, again, talking about Shauna's superpowers, anybody's superpowers. I think, actually, I'm going to tell you a quote really quickly, and then I want to talk about teacher mental health. But somebody said, I saw somewhere where they said, if we took our kids to tutors instead of for the things they struggle at, we took them to tutors for the things they're good at. Imagine how successful they'd be in life. And I mean, I have chills just saying this out loud because,
yeah.
I mean, Daren's worked with me enough to know, I think, that this is truly how I try to run this organization. People will tell me like, oh, that person did this wrong. And I'm like, okay, cool. What did they do right? Like, let's keep focusing on that positive.
Catch them being good.
The superpowers, always like announcing, like I say all the time, I've never done a nonprofit before. I don't actually know what I'm doing. Here are my strengths, though. Let's focus on that. And then I need to make sure I have people who can fill in my gaps, you know? And I think as society, we need to see humanity in that way, where it's not about your weaknesses. It's not about what you do and don't have, but what can you bring to this table and really provide. And the other thing I wanted to say too about teacher mental health is that, you know, clearly this is a topic that's very passionate for me. I did mental health and then I went back to the classroom for a year and I saw all of my educator peers, I know I was before I did the work, in fight, flight, freeze for 40 hours a week at least. Because you have humans in your space all the time and you literally cannot finish a single thought for 40 hours, at least in a week. And so, you know, talking about our kids and like, what is the systemic challenge? Where is, like, I think we need to get this kind of stuff out to our kids. But I think ultimately, like, if parents are dysregulated, it doesn't matter how much, and I use math as our example. We taught the kids the math, but we didn't teach the parents the new math. So now we're teaching the kids all of the math because we're like, I don't know, right? Same thing, like if we don't teach the parents so that they can keep it up and do it in their homes, same thing with the teachers. If they're dysregulated, you're never going to get a regulated kid. You're never going to get a regulated class.
Oh, we saw that all the time in child guidance. But I will say, in the same way that they say, okay, let's say I want to go on a diet and, you know, my husband's not on board, but then when I change how I am, that this family sort of comes along. I did see that with the kids when we would teach them, we would use little sign things. And it's like, what's the emotion behind that? How can we use our words? Very basic stuff. But the families started to learn because the child also was taught something different. And the families also knew the child had like a system backing them up now. So they weren't out there on their own as the designated patient.
And I think families want to help my husband doesn't have a relationship with his parents anymore. And he's always like, my mom was just so awful. And I'm like, I think you assume she did it on purpose, like with intentionality. But I think she like had her own trauma and her own stuff that she like literally, you don't know what you don't know. And she tried her best. And not that that's an excuse or gives, you know, it's not that he can't have his feelings and, you know, she's no longer alive, but they didn't talk before she passed. But, you know, that's still valid. But I think that parents, I've worked with so many kids in challenging situations and tough homes, and we blame and judge the parents so hard. And I'm always like, I think we have to give them the resources and we have to, we don't give parents enough of the resources and enough of the credit.
And that's so true. And I will also say that there are some parents who just are, I've worked with so many people with such severe trauma that it would be very hard to understand. Even if you knew that was intergenerational, it's so difficult, right? So we're not saying to people, just, you know, go ahead, give them grace and forget. We're not saying that. What we're saying is let yourself free from that and whatever it's still pulling at you, you know, let yourself free from that. And maybe that's a paradigm shift, like you said with your husband. Maybe that's a beautiful paradigm shift to say, hey, I get it. And this is what the person was working with. And now let's keep going back with what you're trying to do to make things different, you know?
Yeah, that was a great spot, and I'm going to take us home on that one. We just want to say thank you so much for being here. Before we drop, I know Erin has a question. We kind of already alluded to it, but Erin, if you want to.
If you could rewrite one societal rule about trauma or mental health, and it doesn't have to be a real rule, but what would you do? What would you put out there?
Kindness, compassion, when you don't be so fearful of people you label different or other, or even if somebody's showing something a bit menacing, of course, take care of yourself and maybe operate from a distance, but maybe try to step back for a minute and not view everybody, especially people with schizophrenia, people who have disorders that are much more visible by, you know, being angry or feeling like they're going to be dangerous, because that's not usually the case.
Look
So
for
just
people's
compassion.
humanity. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. We're all teaching each other on this planet.
And we're all
try
human
to
at the
get
end
it
of the day, trying to do our best to
Yeah.
figure it all out. Thank you so much for joining us
Yes,
and for the
thank you,
incredible work that
guys.
you're doing. It was truly a pleasure to have you on the show. If listeners or viewers want to
Likewise.
connect with you for support, how should they do so?
SoulWiseSolutions.com is the website. It has all the book-related things and all the different things that we're working on to help, people understand differently. So that's a great place.
Can you say that website one more time? I'm sorry.
SoulWise, SOULWISE, solutions.com.
Wonderful. And I'm sure we'll tag that in the post. Thank you so much. And to everybody who's
Thank you,
listening,
guys.
this was
loved it.
fantastic. Yes.
This is great.
To everybody who is listening or watching, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on post notifications so you never miss an episode. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting directory, leave us a 5-star rating and a review. Those things, that engagement really helps us to spread our mission. So please help us in that way. If you have any expertise in the mental health world, education, social justice, or just generally want to come chat with us, feel free to email us at unplugged@undomindset.org with Undo Mindset in the subject line. And we are always looking for voices like yours to amplify and engage with. Also, don't forget to share this episode with somebody who it might help, somebody who maybe is intersex, who is schizophrenic, I don't know, who just really wants to hear a fun conversation about mental health stuff. Getting the word out is truly one of the best ways that you can help us in our mission, help us grow, help us really support as many humans as we can in getting these types of skills out to the communities. We appreciate you. Thank you so much and take care.